In recent years, the world has come to live with a continuous sequence of catastrophes, a scenario that, until not long ago, would have seemed like dystopian fiction worthy of George Orwell. Epidemics crossed borders, healthcare systems were pushed to collapse, volcanoes awakened in different regions of the planet, wars intensified, financial markets lost stability, and urban violence spread as an everyday reality. The global feeling is unmistakable. No one is safe anywhere. These catastrophes did not affect only statistics or official reports. They struck directly at ordinary life. Cities began operating under constant alert. Populations lived amid scarcity, fear, and uncertainty. Governments responded with ongoing emergency measures, altering laws, restricting individual freedoms, and imposing forms of social control under relentless pressure. The world entered a survival rhythm, where critical decisions were made with no margin for error. Throughout this period, one factor began to intensify all the others: the escalation of tension between the two most powerful nations on the planet. A direct confrontation ceased to be treated as a distant hypothesis and became a real possibility in the assessments of analysts, governments, and international institutions. For the first time in decades, global stability appears to depend on decisions taken in minutes. A command, a gesture, and worse still, a button capable of ending everything in seconds. Meanwhile, warnings written almost 2,000 years ago described a world marked by successive calamities, global conflicts, natural collapses, economic instability, and extreme concentration of power. The Book of Revelation recorded these signs as part of a single historical process. In recent times, these descriptions have begun to find direct parallels in documented facts, public data, and widely recorded events. 10 prophecies described in Revelation are reflected in real catastrophes experienced in recent years, forming a picture that is impossible to ignore. It is within this territory of tension, where facts and prophecies draw close, that this narrative crosses the valley of redemption, observing signs many would rather not face. The 10th prophecy manifests itself in a silent and continuous manner, advancing without warning and without interruption. The biblical text describes death spreading alongside hunger, disease, and widespread fragility, presented as a prolonged process that seeps into everyday life until it becomes routine. In recent years, this description has ceased to feel distant. The collective experience has come to be marked by a constant presence of biological risk. Diseases crossed borders at unprecedented speed, reaching urban centers, remote regions, and entire countries within a matter of weeks. The idea of containing human movement lost its meaning. The threat began to circulate freely, following trade routes, human flows, and global supply chains. As the threat continued to advance, healthcare systems began operating under permanent pressure. Hospitals came to face recurring maximum occupancy. Exhausted professionals, limited resources, and critical decisions became part of institutional routine. In many places, care ceased to follow ideal medical criteria alone and began to adhere to continuous emergency protocols. The logic of scarcity took hold. This transformation directly affected society's relationship with life itself. Preservation ceased to be guaranteed and began to be managed. Care was reorganized according to available capacity, not absolute need. This shift altered values, priorities, and expectations. Biological security, once presumed, became conditional. At the same time, the constant repetition of alerts, figures, and charts produced a silent effect. Daily exposure to large volumes of deaths reduced the collective emotional impact. Loss ceased to be perceived as a rupture and began to be absorbed as part of the normal flow of events. Death stopped interrupting everyday life. It began to coexist with it. This prolonged coexistence altered basic behaviors. Human contact became mediated by protocols. Proximity was reorganized. Fear ceased to be episodic and became structural. In many contexts, social life was reshaped around an invisible threat, creating a generation accustomed to living under continuous restriction. Over time, the promise of a return to stability was repeatedly postponed. Emergency measures lost their temporary character. States of exception were prolonged. The extraordinary was integrated into the normal administration of society. Instability ceased to be transitional and came to define the environment. The management of this scenario came to be driven by rapid and broad responses, often imposed without genuine public debate. Monitoring, selective restriction, and tracking protocols were implemented on a large scale. Human movement began to be observed, regulated, and conditioned by variable administrative criteria, often altered without clear transparency. This process created a profound precedent. Mobility ceased to be a natural element of modern life and became dependent on authorizations, records, and external validation. Everyday movement was framed as a potential risk. The exception took institutional form. At the same time, economic pressure kept the flow active. Essential workers remained exposed. Basic services continued to function. The supply of food, medicines, and energy required constant circulation. Organized life could not be suspended indefinitely. Risk was incorporated as an operational cost. This incorporation produced lasting effects. Society began to accept elevated levels of exposure as part of routine life. The idea of complete security lost its centrality. The objective became impact reduction, not elimination of the threat. Human circulation continued within a scenario of acknowledged fragility. This gradual adjustment shaped a new normality. The presence of risk no longer paralyzed. It began to coexist with social functioning. Mobility continued, contact persisted, and the threat remained active. The world moved forward with the awareness that danger was not contained, only managed. This is one of the central aspects of the silent death described in the 10th prophecy. It advances when society learns to live with continuous exposure, when movement continues despite risk, when fragility integrates into the system. Silent death does not need noise to spread. It establishes itself when the exceptional becomes habitual, when extreme decisions no longer cause unease, when life continues under permanent alert. This process is already underway. The 9th prophecy describes the sea as a space struck by profound corruption. The image presented is not merely one of visual change, but of functional loss. Waters that cease to sustain life. An environment that becomes unfit, heavy, incapable of maintaining the balance it once provided. In recent years, this description has begun to find direct parallels in reality. Oceans and seas started to register vast zones of biological collapse. Entire regions lost oxygen. Fish disappeared. Marine ecosystems entered silent failure. What was once treated as an isolated phenomenon began to occur repeatedly. These events did not arise from a single cause. The warming of waters, industrial contamination, continuous waste discharge, and chemical imbalance created an unstable environment. In many coastal regions, the sea began to return clear signs of degradation. Toxic foams, altered colors, and mass die-offs ceased to be exceptions. The impact extended beyond the environmental sphere. Communities dependent on the sea lost their livelihoods. Food chains were disrupted. Ports faced interruptions. The ocean, historically associated with abundance and connection between peoples, began to represent sanitary and economic risk. The prophecy does not speak only of natural destruction. It points to a systemic collapse. When the sea becomes ill, the effect spreads. Food disappears, diseases emerge, entire regions enter instability. The foundation that sustains millions of lives begins to fail. This process advanced without sufficient alarm to halt it. Warnings were issued. Reports were published. Isolated measures were announced. Yet the advance continued. Degradation ceased to be urgent news and slipped into the footnotes of technical reports. The ninth prophecy describes a world in which the sea ceases to be a source of life and begins to reflect the general state of creation. An environment corrupted, pressed beyond its limits, responding in irreversible ways. This scenario no longer belongs only to the future. It has begun to manifest before everyone's eyes. The eighth prophecy points to the consolidation of authority on a broad scale. The text describes power gathered, influence extended, and reach that crosses borders. It speaks of structural dominance over peoples, economies, and everyday decisions, going beyond conventional politics. In recent years, this movement has ceased to be theoretical. It has manifested in the way information circulates, is filtered, and, in many cases, interrupted. The Internet, once associated with the decentralization of discourse, became the primary instrument of narrative control. Digital platforms concentrated the flow of news, opinions, and data, operating as mandatory intermediaries between events and the public. This control operates through prioritization, concealment, and demonetization. Content ceases to circulate. Profiles disappear. Topics lose visibility. Exclusion occurs without formal announcement, yet with tangible effects. What does not circulate ceases to exist socially. In countries considered democratic, This mechanism was incorporated gradually. In Canada, entire protests were dismantled through financial blockades and digital restrictions. In Europe, legislation expanded content removal powers under broad criteria of disinformation and security. Platforms began operating in alignment with government guidelines to define the limits of acceptable speech. In China, this model has operated at full scale for years. Information control is centralized and explicit. In other regions, the same effect has been achieved through indirect means, presented as moderation, protection, or social responsibility. The form varies. The outcome converges. This environment altered the relationship between power and truth. Information began to be managed. Official narratives gained automatic priority. Questioning started to generate social and digital sanctions. Doubt was framed as a collective risk. The prophecy describes a system sustained by informational dependence. When communication, work, identity, and access to services pass through the same channels, compliance emerges as a practical consequence. Exclusion becomes an operational mechanism. Successive crises accelerated this process. Emergencies justified stricter filters. The recurring promise involved security, stability, and collective protection. The cost was the progressive erosion of intellectual autonomy. This advance occurred through continuous consent. Each restriction was presented as temporary. Each exception seemed reasonable. Together they revealed a concentrated structure with real capacity to silence, direct, and exclude. The eighth prophecy records the point at which power begins to control what can be seen, said, and believed. A form of dominance that functions without visible force, sustained by infrastructure and dependence. This model already operates to varying degrees across the world. As it becomes normalized, it encounters less resistance. The seventh prophecy describes the gradual withdrawal of peace. The text points to recurring conflicts, organized violence, and an environment in which war ceases to be an exception and begins to structure relations between peoples and states. The sword appears as a symbol of continuous rupture. In recent years, this scenario has taken visible form. Armed conflicts ceased to be localized events and began to overlap across different regions. Open wars coexisted with permanent tensions, constant military exercises, and explicit threats between powers. The planet entered a state of prolonged alert. Modern warfare is no longer confined to clearly defined battlefields. It manifests through long-range missiles, autonomous drones, cyber attacks, and the sabotage of critical infrastructure. Power grids, banking systems, and communications became strategic targets. The boundary between wartime and peacetime lost its clarity. This environment consolidated through successive examples. The escalation in Eastern Europe reshaped the continent's security. In the Middle East, regional conflicts sustained constant instability. In the Indo-Pacific, military maneuvers intensified tensions between nuclear powers. War came to operate as a continuous presence, even when no shots are fired. At the same time, the arms industry expanded. Military budgets grew. Weapons production accelerated. The logic of deterrence came to justify permanent preparedness. Peace ceased to be the final objective and became an uncertain interval. This condition directly affects civilian life. Populations live with constant propaganda, diffuse fear, and the normalization of violence. The discourse of external threat sustains harsh internal decisions. The state of exception is reinforced under the argument of national security. The prophecy describes a world structured around permanent conflict, a system in which war shapes politics, economy, and technology, where continuous tension becomes a mechanism of control. The seventh prophecy records the moment when peace loses its centrality. The sword does not need to be in motion to exert power. It merely needs to be always ready. This scenario already defines the rhythm of global relations. The sixth prophecy points to a world in which violence no longer provokes shock. The text describes a humanity that continues to practice murder, abuse, and injustice without collective repentance. Brutality ceases to be an exception and becomes part of the social environment. In recent years, this transformation has become visible. Violence did not concentrate in a single territory or a single type of crime. It spread across different layers of society. Urban conflicts, indiscriminate attacks, organized crime, and extreme acts began to coexist as part of everyday life. In several regions of Latin America, entire cities lived under the control of armed factions. The use of heavy weaponry by criminal groups ceased to be rare. In some countries, drones began to be used in urban attacks. Crime adopted the language and structure of war, imposing constant fear on the civilian population. In the United States and Europe, individual attacks multiplied. Schools, shopping centers, public events, and places of worship became recurring targets. The repetition of these episodes reduced their initial impact. Tragedies began to be absorbed quickly, replaced by new incidents in ever shorter cycles. Violence also assumed symbolic and psychological forms. Public discourse became more aggressive. Hostility began to circulate as entertainment, and continuous exposure to extreme scenes reduced the collective capacity for reaction. Constant contact with brutality produced accommodation. Over time, serious acts ceased to provoke lasting indignation. Repetition drained their impact, and violence came to be absorbed as part of daily life, without pause and without reflection. Human life lost centrality amid emotional saturation. The sixth prophecy describes this stage with precision. A scenario in which violence no longer needs to hide, where habit replaces shock, and where collective conscience adjusts to brutality as normality. It is a continuous, silent, and cumulative erosion. When violence ceases to generate repentance and begins to be assimilated without moral resistance, the limit has already been crossed. This is the point the prophecy records. The fifth prophecy describes a system capable of regulating access, participation, and economic survival. The text points to a scenario in which remaining within the structure depends on acceptance and conformity. Buying, selling, working, and moving begin to require implicit authorization. In recent years, this movement has become perceptible. Financial systems underwent rapid changes. Physical cash lost ground. Digital payments became the standard. Identity, Access and transactions began to operate within the same environment, creating functional dependence. In many countries, basic services started to require increasingly comprehensive records. Bank accounts, documentation, social benefits, and contracts came to depend on continuous validation. Biometric data and digital histories ceased to be exceptions and became part of everyday life. Public discourse spoke of efficiency and security. The concrete effect was the reduction of alternatives outside the system. This model generated a practical form of exclusion. When all pathways pass through the same structure, refusal prevents the functioning of daily life. Access is no longer guaranteed. Economic participation becomes dependent on full integration into the system. China offers a clear picture of this mechanism in operation. The social credit system links behavior, financial history, and public conduct to scores that directly affect individual freedom. Travel is restricted. Access to services is limited. Employment, enrollment, and movement become subject to automated assessments. This control is reinforced by an extensive network of surveillance cameras, integrated with facial recognition systems and behavioral analysis. Urban movement ceases to be anonymous. Coming and going becomes monitored. Freedom becomes conditional. The concern arises from the principle that sustains this model. Systems begin to decide who may move, consume, and participate in social life. Control establishes itself continuously, sustained by data, scoring, and permanent monitoring. Not even George Orwell could have described such an efficient form of control in his famous novel 1984. In response to this advance, movements emerged focused on preserving economic autonomy outside centralized structures. Bitcoin appeared in this context as a proposal for a decentralized system without a single authority, capable of operating without state or financial intermediaries. Alongside it, libertarian and anarchist currents of thought grew, coming to view monetary control as a central axis of modern power. For these groups, decentralization represents a practical response to the advance of economic control. The proposal involves reducing the ability of institutions to restrict transactions, freeze resources, or condition social participation on behavior. Bitcoin became a symbol of this reaction to growing financial concentration. This movement revealed the central conflict of the prophecy. On one side, integrated, regulated, and traceable systems. On the other, attempts to preserve individual sovereignty in the face of closed structures. The confrontation unfolds in economic, technological, and moral terms. This type of system consolidates itself in stages. Each change appears technical. Each requirement emerges as a necessary update. When the system closes, alternatives have already been reduced. The fifth prophecy records this point of convergence, an environment in which economic participation depends on total integration, where exclusion occurs through control of access. The biblical warning rests on the final effect of this process, a system capable of deciding who participates and who is left out, who exists economically, and who becomes invisible. The fourth prophecy presents the fall of a system built on excess, concentration of wealth, and a permanent sense of stability. Babylon emerges as the image of a global economic order that appears solid while accumulating deep fragilities, sustained by consumption, debt, and artificial confidence. In recent years, this structure has begun to reveal its limits. Markets oscillated with increasing frequency. Public and private debts advanced at an accelerated pace. States began sustaining entire economies through continuous monetary expansion, while real value was diluted. Prosperity became dependent on expectation and credit, increasingly detached from concrete production. Successive crises exposed the vulnerability of the model. Production chains were disrupted. Energy, food, and basic inputs began to be used as instruments of economic pressure. Small businesses disappeared on a large scale, while major conglomerates expanded their share and influence. Concentration advanced silently. The fragility of the system becomes evident when confidence begins to fail. Investors retreat, currencies lose strength, consumption slows, and luxury remains visible while the economic foundation erodes. The shine persists on the surface, sustained by debt and leverage. Babylon represents this modern paradox, a global economy that is interconnected, dependent, and highly sensitive, where local failures propagate rapidly. Banks, funds, and governments operate in an unstable balance, bound together by commitments that require continuous growth in order to avoid collapse. This environment intensifies inequality, while a few concentrate assets, protection, and liquidity. The majority face persistent inflation, loss of purchasing power, and material insecurity. The distance between accumulated wealth and everyday survival continues to widen. The prophecy portrays a moment of sudden rupture. Merchants lament their losses. Fortunes vanish rapidly. What seemed permanent reveals its transient nature. The collapse occurs abruptly because the system was already internally compromised. This fall goes beyond the financial sphere. It strikes values, expectations, and social structures. When the economy ceases to sustain life and instead demands constant sacrifice, the model enters exhaustion. The fall of Babylon symbolizes the end of an order based on excess, dependence, and concentration. A system that accumulated power without building lasting stability. When the illusion of security dissolves, fragility becomes visible to all. A scenario of growing pressure is revealed against those who remain faithful to principles that do not align with the dominant spirit of the system. The third prophecy presents organized forces advancing against a people identified by conviction, endurance, and moral resistance. Hostility develops as a continuous process, shaping the surrounding environment. In recent years, this dynamic has taken concrete form. Faith has ceased to occupy only the personal sphere and has come to be treated as an inconvenience in the public space. Religious values have been framed as incompatible with the new social order, while the space for open expression of belief has gradually narrowed. In various regions, Christian communities have faced direct restrictions. Churches were closed by administrative decisions. Gatherings became dependent on specific authorizations, and religious leaders faced legal sanctions for maintaining traditional practices. Institutional discourse invoked terms such as order, security, and social adaptation, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. In other contexts, pressure advanced through less visible means. Beliefs were classified as offensive, religious content lost reach, and expressions of faith were treated as incompatible with acceptable cultural standards. The result was a progressive retreat of the Christian presence from the public sphere, accompanied by self-censorship and enforced silence. This process is reinforced within a cultural environment that rewards alignment and penalizes dissent. Ridicule replaced debate, social intimidation gained strength, and the cost of maintaining convictions began to affect work, reputation, and personal relationships. Endurance demands constant resistance. The prophecy describes a conflict that manifests through prolonged attrition, a siege acting upon identity, access, and voice, pressuring daily choices and imposing successive renunciations. Resistance ceases to be episodic and becomes a permanent condition. This scenario consolidates as absolute values collide with structures that demand total adaptation. Faith comes to represent moral autonomy within an environment oriented towards conformity, creating continuous tension between conviction and social acceptance. The third prophecy records this critical point. A world in which remaining faithful carries a real cost, where conviction becomes a silent form of resistance, and where constant pressure redefines the meaning of perseverance. The framework is already in place. Ongoing hostility shapes behavior, decisions, and trajectories, revealing a time in which faithfulness ceases to be comfortable and begins to require steadfastness. The second prophecy reveals visible illnesses emerging as signs of a deeper collapse. The human body begins to bear marks that reflect accumulated pressures, collective choices, and submission to structures that demand total adherence. The warning shifts to the most intimate dimension of existence, where pain ceases to be an exception and becomes part of everyday life. In recent years, this picture has become impossible to ignore. Unusual illnesses, difficult to explain syndromes, and persistent physical reactions began to spread silently. Inflammations that do not subside, lesions appearing without clear cause, extreme fatigue, immune collapse, and aggressive skin manifestations became part of the lives of millions. The body began to speak. Medicine advanced, protocols multiplied, diagnoses were refined, yet the overall sensation remained. Something is out of place. Treatments alleviate symptoms, but the origin of the illness remains diffuse. Discomfort became chronic, accompanying routines that no longer allowed genuine rest. The body began to register what the system ignores: constant pressure, continuous surveillance, economic insecurity, and psychological strain produced visible effects. Modern life exceeded basic biological limits. The human organism entered a permanent state of alert, as if it were always under threat. Within this context, one phenomenon gained prominence and began to repeat with unsettling frequency. Autoimmune diseases ceased to be rare diagnoses and became a constant presence in medical practices. People who had always considered themselves healthy began living with persistent inflammation, pain without apparent cause, profound fatigue, and reactions in which the body turns against itself. The body began to attack the body itself. Many of these conditions already existed in a latent, silent, dormant form. What changed was the environment. Years of continuous stress, constant fear, social isolation, material insecurity, and psychological pressure created fertile ground for immune dysregulation. The defense system fell into confusion. What was meant to protect began to injure. The impact is not limited to the physical. Those living with an autoimmune disease face daily uncertainty, prolonged treatments, invisible limitations, and a constant sense of fragility. For many, life is divided into before and after the diagnosis. Normality is broken from within the body itself. This scenario intensified as external interventions became more frequent. Chemical substances, environments saturated with artificial stimuli, and accelerated procedures altered delicate balances. The body reacted. In many cases, it reacted with pain, inflammation, and loss of resilience. The prophecy suggests that these marks carry meaning. The body appears as a mirror of a broader submission. When existence is organized around control, performance, and forced adaptation, the flesh responds. Pain ceases to be merely physical and begins to expose a limit that has been crossed. Across different regions of the world, similar accounts repeat themselves. People who appeared healthy began living with sudden limitations, persistent wounds, and profound exhaustion. Suffering settled in without warning and began to shape daily life. The second prophecy reveals this stage with unsettling clarity, a time in which the body exposes what can no longer be concealed, where accumulated pressure exacts its cost in the skin, the blood, and vital resilience. This process advances alongside the normalization of excess, continuous pressure, and spiritual disconnection. The body absorbs accumulated impacts until it can no longer sustain the imposed weight. The suffering described is neither distant nor symbolic. It restricts movement, drains energy, and weakens the capacity to respond. The warning becomes visible in every organism that can no longer bear the system's burden. The second prophecy marks a limit that has been crossed. When the body begins to carry the signs of collapse, the warning ceases to be abstract. It becomes flesh. The first prophecy directs attention to something even broader. It reaches the very structure of the physical world, as if creation itself begins to react to the accumulated weight of human history. The ground, the seas, and the subterranean fire cease to operate in silence and begin to express tension, instability, and rupture. In recent years, the Earth's activity has ceased to be episodic and has become recurrent. Tremors began to occur more frequently, eruptions appeared in succession, and distant regions recorded extreme events at ever shorter intervals. Areas once considered stable entered states of alert, while historically active zones displayed even more aggressive behavior, indicating pressure building beneath the surface. Volcanoes that had remained dormant for decades returned to expelling ash and gases. Mountain ranges began to register internal movement, and subterranean fire found new paths to the surface. What once seemed distant began to interfere directly with everyday life, interrupting routes, displacing populations, and imposing clear limits on human settlement. Cities were forced to evacuate. Infrastructure was compromised, and entire communities began living with constant uncertainty. The land ceased to be merely a backdrop and assumed an active role in human experience, reminding us that all stability has always been provisional. This impact went beyond the geographical dimension and reached the collective psyche. The sense of control began to dissolve, replaced by an awareness of vulnerability. The environment that sustained civilizations for centuries began to demand attention, respect, and adaptation. The prophecy suggests that this movement carries meaning. When limits are continuously crossed, creation responds. Land, sea, and sky reflect the accumulation of imbalances stretching across generations, manifesting in physical, visible, and unavoidable ways. The pressure placed upon the planet, whether through excessive exploitation, deep intervention, or constant acceleration, exceeds its natural capacity to absorb. The result emerges as rupture, not concentrated in a single point, but distributed, progressive, and increasingly difficult to ignore. This scenario closes the cycle of prophecies with both symbolic and concrete weight. When the very ground no longer offers security, humanity loses its last external support. What remains are consciousness, adaptation, and choice. The first prophecy points to a time when the earth no longer sustains in silence. A warning that requires no interpretation, for it manifests directly in the physical world, before everyone's eyes. Throughout this journey, the prophecies ceased to appear as scattered fragments of an ancient text and began to form a single, coherent picture. Each one illuminates a distinct dimension of human experience, yet all converge on the same scenario. A world subjected to simultaneous pressures, accumulated over time, now visible across multiple layers of reality. The illnesses manifested in the human body reveal more than health crises. They reflect a biologically overburdened humanity, living under rhythms, environments, and decisions that exceed its natural capacity for adaptation. The body becomes a historical indicator, carrying signs of collective wear and structural fragility. When the body begins to bear the marks of collapse, the warning ceases to be abstract and takes form in the flesh. The compromised seas expose another axis of this imbalance. Water, which for centuries sustained populations and economies, now displays clear signs of exhaustion. Ecosystems collapse, coastal zones become unstable, and food chains suffer profound ruptures. What once nourished begins to threaten, revealing the scale of accumulated consequences. The advance of structural control silently and continuously reorganizes social life. Human movement, economic participation, and access to services become dependent on systems operating through data, records, and scoring. Travel is restricted. Access to service is limited. The concern does not arise from technology itself, but from the principle it establishes, models capable of deciding who may move, consume, and fully participate in social life. Not even George Orwell could have described such an efficient form of control in his famous novel 1984. War re-emerges as a permanent state of tension between nations. Military movements, strategic alliances, and veiled threats become part of the international routine. The possibility of destruction ceases to be remote and becomes concentrated in decisions made by a few centers of power, capable of affecting the fate of millions. Violence permeates the social fabric in a broad and persistent manner. It manifests physically, psychologically, and symbolically, shaping behavior, eroding moral reference points, and producing collective adaptation to the extreme. The initial shock dissolves, and brutality comes to coexist with routine, altering human sensitivity. The global economic system, long treated as solid, reveals growing fragility. High levels of debt, concentration of wealth, monetary instability, and dependence on artificial structures expose a model sustained by fragile confidence. When that confidence wavers, the effects reach families, communities, and entire nations, generating prolonged insecurity. The persecution of faith, whether direct or indirect, adds a spiritual dimension to the landscape. The sacred is pushed to the margins of public life, while systems demand total adherence and reject any authority that cannot be administered or conditioned. Spiritual tension becomes part of the same structural process. Finally, the earth itself responds. The ground trembles. Fire emerges. The climate becomes unpredictable. Creation ceases to absorb the weight of human civilization in silence and begins to express exhaustion in physical and unavoidable ways. Environmental instability reveals that even natural foundations have limits. These manifestations draw attention because they arise within the same historical period, accumulating effects and amplifying impact. Health crises, economic instability, geopolitical tension, structural control, and environmental imbalance come to coexist, forming a continuous scenario of global pressure. The prophecies do not function as calendars or records of isolated events. They operate as maps of human behavior and historical consequence, revealing patterns that become visible when certain limits are persistently exceeded. The Book of Revelation acts as a text of structural warning. It exposes processes, indicates directions, and reveals outcomes that emerge when collective choices accumulate over time, shaping entire societies. In the face of this picture, the response required is not emotional but conscious. The moment calls for clarity of perception, an honest reading of the present time, and an understanding that human decisions produce lasting effects, even when signs are minimized or ignored. It is at this point that the Valley of Redemption reveals itself as a central image. A place of passage, not of immediate condemnation, a symbolic space where there remains the possibility of review, repentance, and a change of direction. A valley where consciousness can be awakened before the limits close completely. And in light of this, the question that remains is not tied to the end itself, but to the posture adopted along the way. How each person chooses to remain when the world begins to reveal its own limits defines not only the outcome, but the meaning of the journey.